Thank you for joining today. And just before we start, I would like to let you know that a version of this following presentation was given at the Bill and Melinda Gates Cambridge Day of Research in May 2021. Because this offered a good overview of my research, I've chosen to adapt it slightly for the PAC's Serious Organized Crime Conference. My presentation for you today is Lessons from the Past: How History Can Help Us Care for Modern Slavery Survivors Today. And in the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to propose that reducing global exploitation means a fundamental shift in how we understand crimes like modern slavery and human trafficking. Rather than framing these crimes as the result of individual aberrations or criminal pathology, I argue that trafficking ought to be contextualized in broader global concerns surrounding labor rights, migration patterns, and consumer-driven business models that prioritize quick returns over workers' health and safety. This is particularly important because cases of modern slavery and labor exploitation are expected to increase. Just in the last year, the UK lockdowns have seen a 25% increase in sexual exploitation and a 42% increase in forced labor. Globally, political conflict and the ongoing climate crisis fuel migration. People are made vulnerable to exploitation when they are made stateless. The UNHCR predicts that by 2022, nearly 1.5 million people will be in need of resettlement. I argue that the key to forming good, reliable policy for these current problems actually lies in the past, about 130 years ago, to be precise, with the creation of white slavery as a crime. White slavery was a term used to refer to the forced prostitution of women. Laws against white slavery form the basis for today's anti-trafficking policy. And with that history come preconceptions about trafficking and modern slavery established during those campaigns. Far from being relegated to the margins of history, I argue that white slavery discourse continues to be present within today's discussions of trafficking and modern slavery. By using this discourse analysis to study the annual reports and pamphlets of the National Vigilance Association, a British social reform group dedicated to ending white slavery and trafficking, among other forms of vice, I have found that when reporting on cases of slavery, a similar narrative structure was repeated by the association. Roles were formed around the rescuer, perpetrator, and victim of these crimes. The people occupying these roles were often characterized by similar traits, which were tied to race, gender, and nationality. This narrative structure reinforces itself as it was repeated by the organization. It was flexible enough so that it was able to mold itself to new generations of campaigners while remaining familiar in its structure. The enduring legacy of white slavery discourse persists in part because of the repeated narrative structure it offers. So, how did these roles come about? What was their origin? To understand how social identities became intertwined with the individualized roles of the perpetrator, rescuer, and victim, I'd like to start by taking us back to London in 1885, when the National Vigilance Association was founded. The NVA stood firmly against the sexual exploitation of women and girls. They lobbied Parliament, set up international networks, and provided housing for survivors. Their reach was large, with over 71 chapters across England opening in just their first year. 30 years later, the NVA would contract with the Home Office to assist in the repatriation of women identified as victims of trafficking. Throughout their time, the NVA also sought legal reforms which they believed would end white slavery. These included restricting immigration into Britain. Within white slavery discourse, there was a pervasive focus on foreignness as an indicator of criminal pathology and trafficking. For example, in support of the 1905 Aliens Act, which would go on to restrict the entry of Jewish migrants into Britain, the NVA reflected that, quote, "In the course of our work, we have for a long time been convinced that the foreign criminals, both men and women, are a dangerous menace to our social, moral, and national life. The terrible conditions on the streets of London was almost exclusively due to their presence. While there might have been economic and socio-political reasons that immigration and exploitation followed each other, the NBA latched onto a uniquely Victorian ideal of social reform that collapsed crime and foreignness into co-constructive categories that were inherent to a single person rather than systemic features. Because of this, victims of trafficking who were non-UK citizens did not escape criminalization either. Work of historians such as Julia Late and Rachel Atwood have demonstrated how migrant women who were victims of white slavery were understood to be partially culpable in their own victimization because of inherent moral defects based on gender, class, or ethnicity. Atwood examines the role of the Jewish Association for the Protection of Girls and Women that worked to alleviate forced prostitution of Jewish women. Women who were victims were given help, but also described as, quote, weak-minded or morally dubious by the association, traits assumed to be inherent because of their low-class status. In this rhetorical move, Jewish women were made culpable for their own victimization in white slavery discourse. The concept extends to migrants and foreign nationals of different ethnic backgrounds who were swept up in white slavery campaigns and used to simultaneously argue for their rescue and punishment. Foreign women who were victims of white slavery were also held in comparison to white, young British women who were framed as naive, innocent victims. In this framing, you can begin to see the divisions between worthy and unworthy victim tropes that we are still contending with today. Through the repetition of trait association in NBA reports, discourse surrounding white slavery converged into a narrative structure wherein attributes such as gender, foreignness, and class were ascribed to the roles of the rescuer, perpetrator, and victim. The roles were not strictly fixed, but they did offer a template from which the National Vigilance Association and those reading their materials could understand how trafficking functioned and its root cause. For instance, there was rarely an acknowledgement of social factors such as poverty, unemployment, or immigration laws in the NBA materials that might have shaped the surrounding environment for each person involved. Rather, when these aspects were mentioned, they were individualized to highlight the passivity and hopelessness of feminized victims, or conversely, the ruthlessness, moral depravity of the perpetrator. But how could an organization founded over 130 years ago really shape the contemporary discussions on trafficking and modern slavery today? Really, in essence, how does this impact us today? While using this discourse, the National Vigilance Association shaped white slavery laws of the early 20th century. These, in turn, would influence the League of Nations and ultimately the 1949 UN Convention Against the Traffic in Persons. It was this 1949 convention which directly shaped the Palermo Protocols of 2000. In this way, there is a direct legal lineage between white slavery and contemporary anti-trafficking law. And with that legacy comes the predetermined narrative structures surrounding victimhood, crime, and rescue. Far from disappearing into history, the narratives and discourse surrounding white slavery have reformed and adapted themselves into today's conversations on modern slavery and human trafficking. My current research focuses on the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. While the Act has ushered in new and innovative responses to global exploitation, such as Section 54, which requires companies to assess for modern slavery in their supply chains, I argue that the Act also remains constrained by white slavery narratives. The vestiges of white slavery still clinging on to anti-trafficking discourse weigh down effective policy decisions that could reduce exploitations and help survivors. For example, consider discussions on untying the overseas domestic worker visa within the Modern Slavery Act. When the MSA was being drafted, there was an opportunity to change the law such that domestic workers were no longer dependent on their employers for legal status. This would reverse a decision in 2012 where domestic workers lost the right to change employers. After the 2012 change, workers looking to leave an abusive or exploitive employer would risk losing their visa. This created a severe power imbalance between employee and employer that is rife for forced labor and exploitation. Sure enough, after domestic workers were tied to their employers, the rate of physical abuse doubled. Yet, even before the 2012 changes, the UK government was aware of the exploitation happening within the overseas domestic worker visa. As early as 2009, the Home Affairs Select Committee identified the visa as, quote, the single most important issue in preventing the forced labor and trafficking of such workers, end quote. Yet, when the Modern Slavery Act had the opportunity to untie the domestic workers visa, they didn't. So what is happening here? We've gone from introducing an innovative law, one intended to end modern slavery, to a bill that suddenly holds back when it comes to protecting the most vulnerable of workers. I would argue that this is evidence of a holdover from white slavery discourse, a conflation between immigration, modern slavery, and culpability, which continues to exist within policy debates. When the draft modern slavery bill recommended untying the overseas domestic worker visa, the UK government feared that doing so would increase immigration of low-skilled workers into the UK. The government responded to this draft by saying, quote, it would allow employers, including UK citizens, to bring domestic workers for longer periods. Permitting a change of employer once in the UK would not be compatible with the purpose of this route, which is to allow a short visit with an existing employer. It is not the government's policy to facilitate low-skilled migration to the UK. It is concern over immigration then, which keeps domestic workers, and mostly women, constrained within an easily exploited visa. There's an attempt in this logic to skirt around legal changes by siloing migration away from modern slavery. However, we know from the creation of white slavery laws that immigration was an essential component to understanding trafficking and assigning roles of victim or perpetrator. Acknowledging this past is key to confronting where we see it today. Separating immigration and modern slavery leaves migrants who are exploited in a separate category from modern slavery victims. Resigned here, they are considered culpable in their own victimization, just as the white slavery victims were before them. The question of immigration remains steadfast in how we understand victimhood in modern slavery discussions. For example, the National Referral Mechanism is the UK government's body responsible for reporting and evaluating potential cases of modern slavery. A positive conclusive grounds decision from the NRM means that a survivor is eligible for financial support from the state and temporary leave to remain. A 2012 study found that a potential survivor of modern slavery from the EU has an 80% chance of a conclusive grounds decision from the NRM. In contrast, a potential survivor from outside of the EU has a less than 20% chance of a conclusive grounds decision. This indicates that immigration and modern slavery law exist in an ongoing dialectic where truth and legitimacy of victimhood are continuously called into question. This is not a new phenomenon by any means, but rather something that has been implicit from the very conception of trafficking law and victimhood itself through white slavery narratives. The narratives surrounding immigration, trafficking, and white slavery at the turn of the century were still very much alive in today's discussion of modern slavery and human trafficking. Questions of race, gender, and nationality continue to underpin the anti-slavery sector and must be excavated so that we can push forward towards new solutions. Thank you very much for your time.